Before we delve into this story, if you enjoy dark mysteries, tales involving abandoned houses, unexplained disappearances, and situations that seem to defy logic, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any stories like this one, which go far beyond what appears to be just a simple narrative. Now tell me something. Where are you watching this story from today? In the early 1960s, in the state of Mississippi, a dirt road silently cut through an isolated region surrounded by dense forests and damp fields that seemed never to dry completely. At the end of this road stood Holloway Mansion, an old building of Southern architecture with white columns grimy with time, tall windows always partially covered by heavy curtains, and a constant silence that seemed not to belong to the living world. The story begins with Daniel Harper, a 34-year-old investigative journalist known for his insistence on uncovering cold cases and events ignored by the local press. Daniel had arrived in Mississippi after receiving an anonymous letter containing only one sentence: "The truth is still inside Holloway Mansion, and it was never buried alone." No signature, no explanation, just an address. On the other side of this story was the Holloway family, one of the oldest and most influential in the region, led by Edward Holloway, a man publicly respected as a philanthropist, but surrounded by rumors that no one dared to confirm. The mansion, according to the oldest residents of the region, had been closed to the world since 1974. Although lights were still seen on some specific nights, always without logical explanation. Daniel arrives in the town of Pinebrook on a cloudy morning. He quickly notices that the residents avoid any mention of the mansion. When it is mentioned, there is always an uncomfortable silence, followed by vague answers or sudden changes of subject. The tension lies not in what is said, but in what is avoided. While investigating old files in the small-town registry office, Daniel discovers incomplete records of disappearances spanning decades, all with a strange, indirect connection to the Holloway family. No case was solved, no body was found, and even more unsettling, all official records were filed as inconclusive due to lack of evidence. The story's antagonism is not revealed directly. Edward Holloway never appears in person in this initial phase, but his presence is felt in every detail, in the nervous behavior of the civil servants, in the refusal of former employees to talk about the past, and in the way certain doors seem to close before they are even opened. Daniel decides to visit the grounds of the mansion before making any formal attempt at contact. As he approaches, he realizes that the property doesn't seem abandoned, but rather carefully managed. The garden is meticulously maintained, as if someone were tending to it with strict discipline. However, there are no clear signs of who is doing this work. The first element of mystery emerges when Daniel finds, near the side fence of the property, a small, partially buried notebook. The pages are deteriorated, but some sentences are still legible. Names, dates, and short descriptions of events that seem to make no sense in isolation. One of the names coincides with that of one of the missing persons from the 1970s. The narrative's atmosphere intensifies when, while trying to photograph the mansion, Daniel realizes that his camera repeatedly fails to focus on the upper windows. There is no apparent technical explanation. The feeling is that something inside the house is preventing it from being captured. Meanwhile, the city begins to react to his presence. People who previously ignored him now observe him more closely. A local bar owner discreetly warns him to abandon the investigation, saying only some doors weren't made to be opened again. Daniel, however, does not back down. He senses that there is something bigger hidden there, not just family secrets, but a network of events covered up by decades of collective silence. The introduction ends with Daniel receiving a second anonymous message, left in his hotel room overnight. This time, there are only 3 words written on aged paper: "She is still breathing." The feeling that Holloway Manor is not just a place, but a living system of secrets begins to solidify in the narrative, and even without having crossed its doors, Daniel already finds himself emotionally captivated by the mystery it represents. The town of Pinebrook seemed trapped in another era. In 1960, while the country was advancing in social and technological changes, time moved more slowly there, as if slowed down by the landscape itself. The streets were few, the businesses were old, and the residents' routine followed an almost ritualistic pattern of silence and observation. Strangers were perceived even before they were clearly seen. Daniel Harper notices this in the first few days of his stay. The hotel where he's staying is small, with dark wood furniture and creaking hallways. The receptionist avoids prolonged eye contact, but knows exactly who he is. In small towns, news travels faster than people. As Daniel walks through downtown Pinebrook, he notices how the presence of Holloway Mansion permeates everything, even without being directly mentioned. It's an implicit subject, a collective weight. In a casual conversation at the local market, he realizes that simply mentioning the house at the end of the road is enough to change the atmosphere. Smiles disappear, and hands stop moving for a few seconds longer than usual. It is in this context that Martha Ellison emerges, a retired teacher who lives in a simple house on the outskirts of the city. Unlike the other residents, she doesn't show immediate fear when she hears questions about the mansion, but rather a profound weariness, as if she had already answered those same questions many times throughout her life. Martha reveals important fragments of the past. She mentions that decades ago, Holloway Mansion was not just a residence, but also a social meeting place for the local elite. Parties were frequent, discreet meetings took place away from the eyes of most of the population, and some deals were made without official records. However, she avoids direct details, always interrupting herself when she approaches something more specific. According to her, everything began to change after an event in 1974, known only as the Night of Silence. Why? At that time, the mansion was supposedly suddenly closed, and several people associated with the Holloway family disappeared from public life. No official explanation was given, only the gradual disappearance of any reliable information. Meanwhile, Daniel tries to piece together a timeline with the documents he found. He realizes that the disappearances are not random. There is a subtle pattern. All the cases are linked to people who in some way had direct contact with the property or its former residents. Meanwhile, a new indirect character emerges in the investigation: the local sheriff, Harold Cunningham. A man of rigid posture, controlled speech and little inclination for long conversations. He doesn't directly impede Daniel's investigation, but makes it clear that he prefers it not to proceed. In one of their brief interactions, he simply says, "Some truths don't help anyone here." The atmosphere grows heavier as Daniel returns to the grounds of Holloway Manor for the second time. This time, he's not alone in his feelings. There are recent marks on the ground near the fence, as if someone had walked there during the night. Footprints that don't follow a clear pattern of entry or exit. Upon closer investigation, he notices something even more disturbing. The mansion's lights, which previously seemed random, now follow a pattern. It's not an abandoned house. It's a house that responds to time. That same night, Daniel begins to have trouble sleeping. Distant, almost imperceptible sounds seem to come from the direction of the property. They are not clear voices, but variations in the silence, as if the environment itself were being disrupted by something that does not belong to the ordinary nature of things. The story's depth lies not only in the discovery of facts, but also in the building of a growing sense of surveillance. Daniel isn't just investigating Holloway Manor, he's beginning to feel like he's being watched by it. Meanwhile, Martha Ellison disappears from her residence without explanation. Her house remains untouched, with a cup of coffee still on the table and the back door slightly ajar. No sign of a struggle, no clear trail of escape. The city, however, does not react as if something extraordinary had happened. The collective silence remains, as if the disappearance were just another expected element within that old cycle of unresolved events. Daniel then realizes that Pinebrook is not just a setting, it's part of the system of silence that surrounds the mansion. And for the first time, he understands that the investigation isn't just revealing the past, it's activating something that never ceased to exist. In the days following Martha Ellison's disappearance, Pinebrook seems even more closed off from the public eye. There's no public outcry, no intense police activity. The case is treated with a disturbing nonchalance, as if her absence had somehow been foreseen. Daniel realizes that this normalization of the strange is an unwritten rule of the town. He decides not to wait for indirect signs anymore and acts directly again. Armed with his notes and the scant evidence he has gathered, he tries to confront Sheriff Harold Cunningham once more. This time, the conversation takes place inside the police station, an old building with creaking ceiling fans and piles of disorganized files. Harold listens to Daniel in silence, without interrupting. When he finally responds, he doesn't deny the facts, but he doesn't confirm them either. He merely reinforces that Holloway Manor is not a common case, and that certain investigations don't lead to the truth, but to the repetition of the problem. The phrase, "this has happened before," hangs in the air without explanation. From this point on, the conflict ceases to be merely investigative and becomes one of active resistance. Daniel begins to notice that his movements are being followed. A car is always parked a few streets away from the hotel. An unknown man is watching the entrance to the public archives. Small signs, but consistent enough not to be a coincidence. At the same time, he revisits the old documents with more urgency. The pattern of the disappearances now seems clearer. All the victims had some attempt at connection with Holloway Mansion or its historical records. Some were journalists, others independent researchers, and even civil servants who worked on reorganizing municipal archives. The conflict intensifies when Daniel finds a new name among the old records. Thomas Ellison, a distant relative of Martha, who disappeared under similar circumstances decades earlier. This creates a direct link between the recent disappearance and past events, suggesting that history not only repeats itself, but also fits together. In an attempt to move forward, Daniel decides to return to the mansion at night, defying all safety precautions. The path there seems longer than before, even though it's the same road. The surrounding forest seems denser, as if it had grown since his last visit. When he finally reaches the property fence, he notices that something has changed. The interior lighting is brighter than before, as if the house were awake. The upper windows show moving shadows, but no shapes are clearly identifiable. As he tries to get closer, Daniel hears for the first time a sound coming from the structure of the house. Not a voice, but something like a distant, irregular, almost mechanical breathing. He can't determine where it's coming from, but the feeling is that the building itself is alive. At this point, the conflict ceases to be merely external. Daniel hesitates for the first time. Not out of simple fear, but out of a growing realization that the mansion is not just a place where things happened, but a system that reacts to his presence. Taking a few steps back, he notices something even more disturbing. New marks on the ground, close to his own footprints, as if someone had been walking beside him the entire time, but always out of his field of vision. Back at the hotel, he finds his room ransacked. There are no signs of theft. Nothing has been taken. Only his files are rearranged in a different order than he had left them. Among them, a new piece of paper appears, unsigned. Just one sentence. "You already have what you're looking for." From that moment on, the conflict ceases to be solely about discovering the truth. It begins to involve the perception that the investigation itself is being monitored, interpreted, and in some way answered. Daniel understands that he is not dealing with a static secret, but with something dynamic, something that reacts to attempts to reveal it. And for the first time, he begins to consider that perhaps Holloway Manor isn't hiding answers, but choosing who can look for them. The feeling of being watched ceases to be merely an annoyance and becomes a constant part of Daniel's routine in Pinebrook. He begins to organize his days more cautiously, avoiding predictable patterns, changing routes and schedules, trying to identify if someone is really following him or if the city itself is reacting collectively to his presence. But what once seemed like paranoia is beginning to take on concrete form. On a grey morning, as he leaves the hotel, Daniel notices the same car again, parked at a fixed distance. But this time, when he suddenly changes direction, the vehicle doesn't follow. It simply remains still, as if it weren't a pursuer, but an observation point. This unsettles him even more. There's no active pursuit, just monitoring. Meanwhile, a new subplot emerges indirectly through old records. The name of Samuel Whitaker, a municipal archivist who worked at Pinebrook in the 1950s and disappeared shortly before the Night of Silence in 1974. Daniel finds fragmented notes suggesting that Whitaker was reorganizing documents related to Holloway Mansion shortly before he vanished. These notes are not complete, but they reveal something important. Whitaker wasn't just cataloging old events. He seemed to be trying to identify patterns among disappearances, as if he already suspected there was a repetitive structure behind the cases. The complexity increases when Daniel discovers that Whitaker left one last piece of correspondence addressed to an institution outside the city, but the letter never reached its destination. Instead, it was intercepted and filed locally as irrelevant material. Alongside this, a new figure emerges in the narrative. Irene Caldwell, a retired nurse who lives in isolation on the outskirts of Pinebrook. Unlike Martha Ellison, Irene completely avoids the subject of the mansion. However, her reaction to the name Holloway is not just fear, it's an immediate physical reflex, as if her body responds before her mind. Daniel finds her after following an indirect clue in the city's old medical records. Irene had worked at a small local hospital during the 1960s and 70s, a period when several missing persons received treatment there before officially disappearing from civil records. When she finally agrees to speak, albeit in a fragmented way, she mentions something disturbing. Some patients were not just victims of accidents or illnesses. They arrived at the hospital already altered, confused, disoriented, as if they had lost part of their recent memory. In some cases, they repeatedly asked about a house they couldn't fully describe. Irene refuses to continue beyond that point, ending the conversation abruptly, as if she had crossed a personal line. As these subplots connect, the city's behavior becomes even stranger. Small services begin to fail only for Daniel. Documents temporarily disappear when he tries to consult them. People who previously spoke minimally to him now avoid any direct interaction. His isolation within the investigation itself begins to intensify. At the same time, there's a disturbing new development. Daniel notices that some of his own notes are slightly shifting between revisions. They aren't major changes, but enough to raise doubts. A date written differently, a name reversed, small inconsistencies that shouldn't be happening. This leads him to a disturbing hypothesis. Someone may be interfering not only with his surroundings, but with how he perceives reality. The conflict ceases to be merely external and begins to expand into something more psychological without losing its concrete basis. Daniel is not just being observed, he may be being influenced. The subplots, now interconnected, reveal a broader pattern. All the people who tried to get too close to Holloway Manor not only disappeared or were silenced, they were fragmented into incomplete records, contradictory memories, and inconsistent versions of their own story. And amidst all this, a final detail emerges from this phase. One of the pages of the notebook Daniel found on the mansion's fence now contains a new note that he doesn't remember seeing before. Recent writing. Even darker ink. The phrase is simple but unsettling. You're not discovering it, you're being rewritten. The night in Pinebrook that week was nothing out of the ordinary, but to Daniel Harper, everything felt off, as if the town were slightly out of alignment with the reality he knew. The wind carried no normal sounds, only a silence heavier than usual, almost physical. He decides to review all the material he has again, trying to find some logical flaw, some misinterpretation that explains the inconsistencies in the notes. However, the more he rereads the documents, the more he realizes that they seem to respond to his reading. Phrases that were once clear now seem ambiguous. Dates that made sense begin to mentally rearrange themselves, as if his own memory were being adjusted. This is the first time Daniel feels something close to an internal rupture. He no longer knows if he is investigating a story or if he is being led through it. The turning point comes when he receives an unexpected call in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end doesn't identify itself. It simply says a short, paused sentence with slight interference on the line. You need to see what was never properly recorded. Before he can respond, the call is ended. Minutes later, he finds a new envelope under the hotel door, unlike the previous ones. It's not old nor hidden. It seems to have been placed there recently. Inside is a single key and a handwritten address: Basement Archive, Old County Courthouse. The most unsettling detail is that this place doesn't appear on any current city map. Daniel decides to go immediately. The old courthouse is located in a forgotten area of Pinebrook, a heavily framed, partially abandoned building with windows covered by nailed wood. The main entrance is locked, but the key he received fits perfectly into a side door he hadn't noticed before. Upon entering, the atmosphere changes completely. The air is colder, drier, and there's a strong smell of old paper mixed with something metallic, almost imperceptible but constant. He descends a narrow staircase to the basement, where long corridors lead to archive rooms that are not listed in any official records. What he finds there completely changes the direction of the investigation. Folders and documents, meticulously organized, contain records that contradict the entire narrative he had been constructing up to this point. Disappearances he believed to be random are, in fact, part of an old administrative pattern. There are signed forms, internal authorizations, and reports indicating that cases linked to Holloway Mansion were not merely investigated. They were classified, reviewed, and deliberately filed under different identities. And then comes the most shocking revelation. The name Daniel Harper appears in one of the old files, not as a journalist, but as an associated case. The registration date predates his arrival in Pinebrook. For a moment, the atmosphere seems to lose depth. The words on the paper don't just inform, they confront him directly. There are entire pages describing an investigation he himself conducted, years before he even began the search. Reports signed with his signature, first-person observations he doesn't recognize. The turning point comes when he finds a photograph filed inside a sealed envelope. In it, he appears in front of Holloway Mansion, but the image is dated 1974, the same date as the Night of Silence. The shock isn't just emotional. It's structural. The logic of the narrative begins to break down. Daniel realizes he's not just dealing with a local conspiracy or a series of old disappearances. He's inside a record-keeping system that seems to rewrite people, events, and even identities over time. As he tries to rationalize what he's seeing, a sound echoes down the archive corridor. Slow footsteps, not hurried, but deliberate. as if someone knew exactly where he was. He instinctively turns off the flashlight. The silence that follows is not empty, it is filled with expectation. And then, for the first time, a voice echoes directly in the room, with no clear origin. "You came back earlier than you should have." Daniel doesn't answer, not because he doesn't want to, but because something inside him understands that any answer is already part of a pattern he no longer controls. The final revelation at this turning point isn't just about the mansion or about Pinebrook. It's about his own role within that structure. The investigation didn't begin when he arrived in town. It was already underway before he even existed as an investigator. And now, upon finding records of himself in a past he doesn't remember living, Daniel understands that Holloway Manor holds more than just secrets. She rearranges reality around those who try to get too close. When Daniel leaves the underground archive of the old courthouse, he no longer feels like he's leaving the same place he entered. The staircase seems longer on the way back. The corridor, narrower. The walls, slightly different, as if the building had been rearranged while he was inside. Nothing is clearly changed, but everything is subtly out of place, enough to generate constant disorientation. Outside, the night remains silent in Pinebrook, but the silence now feels unnatural. It carries an added weight, as if waiting for something to happen. Daniel still holds the key in his pocket, even without knowing why he didn't throw it away. It feels heavier than it should be. The consequences of what he found begin to manifest themselves immediately and progressively. At the hotel, the first change is subtle. The receptionist doesn't recognize him immediately. She checks a register twice before confirming his reservation. Then she hesitates, as if something in the system isn't quite aligned with his presence. It's a brief hesitation, but enough to cause discomfort. When Daniel goes up to his room, he notices that his suitcase is in the same place, but organized differently. Clothes folded with a precision he didn't do, objects rearranged into categories that don't correspond to his personal logic. There's no sign of forced intrusion, just silent interference. He opens his research notebooks and finds another alteration. Entire pages rearranged in a different chronological order. Some notes have partially disappeared, as if they had been selectively erased. Others have emerged with handwriting that resembles his, but with subtle inconsistencies in style. Daniel's initial reaction is not immediate fear, but an attempt at control. He tries to mentally reconstruct the timeline of events, but realizes that his own memory begins to falter at specific points. Not large gaps, but small uncertainties. Did this happen before or after? Did I really see this or just read about it? Meanwhile, Pinebrook reacts in an even stranger way. The next day, people in town begin to treat him as someone who has been there before. Not with warm familiarity, but with a strange naturalness, as if his presence were recurring. A man in the market calls him by name, even though he hasn't introduced himself that day. A woman on the street comments that he always comes back when he starts looking too hard. What's most disturbing is that no one seems to contradict these claims. The consequences deepen when Daniel tries to access the municipal archives again. Now, some documents that were previously available appear as restricted due to duplicate query history. Others are marked with his name as the applicant on earlier dates on which he is absolutely certain he was not in the city. Reality is starting to behave like a record that has already been edited. Upon returning to the vicinity of Holloway Manor that night, he notices another change. The property seems closer than before, not physically but perceptibly. The travel time to it is shorter, even following the same route. The road seems to shorten without logical explanation. And then the most direct consequence of the tipping point occurs. As he approaches the fence again, one of the side doors of the mansion is partially open. He hadn't seen it open before. From the inside, there is no obvious light, but there is a sense of depth, as if the interior space were larger than the exterior structure allows. It's not just a house, it's a distorted continuity. Daniel doesn't go in immediately. For the first time, he hesitates not out of fear of the unknown, but because he recognizes that the unknown has already begun to respond to his presence. Behind him, light footsteps echo on the dirt road. When he turns around, no one is visible. But the nearby vegetation is slightly trampled, as if someone had just passed by and was still present enough not to disappear completely from the environment. The most unsettling consequence, however, is not outside, it's in him. Upon opening his notebook again, he finds a new entry, written in his own handwriting, entry confirmed, continuity restored. He doesn't remember writing that, and for a brief moment, doubt arises, reorganizing everything that came before. If it's being rewritten, how many versions of it have already gone through this same investigation? And how many of them reach that same point before disappearing? At that point, Daniel was no longer trying to convince himself that it could all be explained simply as human manipulation or accumulated coincidences. Something deeper was at stake, not just about Holloway Manor, but about the very continuity of reality around him. Still, giving up didn't seem like an option. It was as if the research had become a thread attached to him, and not the other way around. The difference was now visible in his behavior. Daniel no longer reacted like a journalist seeking external answers. He began to act like someone trying to avoid being reorganized by his own environment. His movements became more calculated, his writing more objective, almost telegraphic. He reduced lengthy notes and began to record only verifiable facts at the exact moment they happened, as if any interpretation could be distorted later. This change wasn't philosophical, it was a matter of survival. The following morning, he decides not to return to the mansion immediately. Instead, he observes patterns. He sits in public places in Pinebrook, simply analyzing repetitions. Who passes him twice on the same route, which conversations seem to be resumed identically on different days, which details of the city seem to repeat behaviors. And he discovers something disturbing. The city is not just silent, it's cyclical. Some events seem to repeat themselves with slight variations. A delivery truck that always passes by at the same time, but with small differences in cargo. A group of children playing in the park, repeating similar routes on alternate days. Nothing is exactly the same, but everything follows a corrected pattern, as if something were constantly adjusting imperfections. This changes how Daniel interprets everything he has experienced so far. He stops seeing Pinebrook as a place that hides secrets and begins to see it as a continuously running system. Holloway Manor, in this context, would not only be the center of the mystery, but the control point of this system. His transformation intensifies when he makes a decision unlike any he's made before. He stops reacting and starts testing. Instead of avoiding the mansion, he begins to create small variations in the pattern. He walks different routes without apparent purpose. He returns to the same place at different times. He intentionally leaves objects out of place in the hotel and observes what happens the next day. Responses are coming, but not as direct punishments, rather as adjustments. An object returns to its correct place without explanation. A record is automatically corrected. A conversation he had with someone is simply not remembered the next day by the other person involved. Reality doesn't confront him. She corrects him. This realization forces an even deeper change in his behavior. Daniel realizes that insisting on linear logic no longer works. He begins to accept the possibility that the investigation does not follow normal human rules, and instead of resisting this emotionally, he adapts his strategy. He decides to enter the mansion again, but this time not as someone seeking answers, but rather as someone trying to observe the inner workings of the system. The preparation is different. He doesn't take excessive equipment. He doesn't carry lengthy documents. Just a simple notebook and a flashlight. Before leaving, he rewrites a single sentence at the top of the first page. Do not trust the continuity of memories after entry. Upon arriving at the property, the sense of closeness he had felt before now becomes more intense. The mansion not only seems more accessible, it seems expectant. The side door that was previously ajar is now wide open, as if it had never been closed. This time, Daniel doesn't hesitate out of fear. He hesitates out of awareness of what this means. He crosses the line. The moment you enter, the sound of the outside environment disappears completely. There is no wind, insects, or any natural noise. Just an internal silence, structured, almost architected. The interior of the mansion does not follow normal proportions. Corridors seem longer than they should be, and the perspective changes as you move forward. The first noticeable change in him happens there. His sense of time begins to lose stability. He can no longer fully trust the duration of his own steps. Even so, he continues, because for the first time he understands that he is no longer trying to find the origin of the mystery. He's trying to figure out if there's still a version of himself that he hasn't completely absorbed. And as he walks down the main corridor, a new realization emerges, not as a thought, but as an instinctive certainty. The mansion reacts more than just to his presence. She is adjusting the way he perceives himself. Inside Holloway Mansion, the silence isn't empty, it's structured. Each of Daniel's steps seems absorbed by the walls, as if sound doesn't propagate, but is archived by the environment itself. The notion of time is no longer reliable. He can't tell if he's been inside the house for minutes or hours. Even so, he continues to move forward. This time, there's no rush in the investigation. There's observation. Daniel realizes that the mansion is not just a physical space, but a sequence of environments that seem to subtly rearrange themselves with each return of his attention. A corridor that seemed straight, when revisited with his gaze, reveals a slight incline. A door that once led to an office now opens onto a descending staircase that wasn't there before. He understands that he is not exploring the house. He is being guided by her. The build-up to the climax begins when he finds signs of other presences within the mansion. Not people in the traditional sense, but traces of previous attempts at exploration. Marks on walls that look like erased notes. Pieces of paper embedded in cracks with words partially destroyed. Fragments of records that don't belong to a single era. And then he finds something crucial. A room that doesn't appear in any previous angle of the house. The door is open. Inside, there's a long table covered with layers of overlapping documents. They aren't organized like normal files. They're stacked like successive versions of the same story. Names repeated with slight variations, dates that contradict each other, records of people who, in theory, never lived together during the same period. What is most unsettling is that Daniel's name appears in multiple versions of these documents, as if his presence were a recurring element in different iterations of the investigation. He begins to understand the structure of what he is facing. The mansion holds more than just secrets. She keeps different versions of herself. As he examines the documents, he notices that some papers are still in the process of being altered. The words change slightly as he observes, as if the record were being updated in real time to suit his reading. This marks the beginning of the final acceleration. Daniel realizes that everything inside the mansion is converging on a central point. There are no more separate subplots. Martha, Irene, the old files, the disappearances, everything converges into a single control structure that seems to reorganize memories, records, and identities. He then finds a new room at the end of the corridor, a door that wasn't there when he passed by before. This time, it's closed, but not locked. When he touches the doorknob, he feels a slight, almost symbolic resistance, as if the house were testing his intentions. Upon partially opening the door, he sees a descending staircase that doesn't end in a typical basement, but in a deeper space where the architecture seems to lose its coherence. The walls descend at impossible angles, and the lighting doesn't come from visible sources, but from a diffuse presence. Before descending, Daniel quickly reviews everything that is still under his control: the notebook, the flashlight, and the very awareness of his mission. But there is a new concern now. He no longer fully trusts his own recent memories. Some moments inside the house already seem to have been edited without warning. This forces one last decision before the climax. He begins to mark time externally, drawing lines on paper for each sequence of events, trying to create a record that the mansion cannot easily rewrite. As he descends, he notices that the air changes. It doesn't just get colder, it becomes more organized, as if each breath has a defined structure. And then he understands the final preparation needed for what is about to happen. He's not getting close to a secret. It is getting closer to the core group responsible for deciding what can and cannot be remembered. And, for the first time, he fully accepts the possibility that the climax will not simply be a revelation, but a direct dispute over the continuity of his own identity. The staircase doesn't end like a regular staircase ends. It simply ceases to be a staircase. Daniel realizes this when the last step beneath his feet loses its solid definition and becomes a continuous surface, as if the very concept of descending had been replaced by another logic. Ahead, the space opens up into a structure impossible to measure. Corridors that do not follow a stable geometry, walls that seem to exist in layers, and lighting that comes not from any single point, but from a constant state of presence. He is no longer inside a house, it's inside a mechanism. The silence is now absolute, but not empty. It has texture, as if it carries information. Daniel feels that his every move is registered without delay, not by cameras or devices, but by the environment itself. Holloway Manor doesn't observe, it processes. At the center of this space, there is a structure that shouldn't exist. A kind of circular room formed by layers of documents suspended in the air, as if time had been physically stacked there. Papers float slowly, rearranging themselves, connecting names, dates, and events in sequences that endlessly unravel and reconstruct themselves. And then he sees the core. It's not a machine, it's not a person, it's a living interface of records. Something between memory and architecture that responds to its presence as if you've recognized it for a long time. The voice emerges without origin. It doesn't echo. It simply exists within space. You've reached the point where the versions converge. Daniel gripped the notebook tightly. The lines he used to mark time no longer seemed reliable. Some had been altered. Others didn't match what he remembered writing. Even so, he remained focused. If everything here could be rewritten, he needed a fixed point outside the system. He begins to speak aloud, not to engage in dialogue, but to register his existence. I'm Daniel Harper. I came here on an investigation. I don't belong here. A brief silence answers. Then the structure around it reacts. The suspended documents begin to violently reorganize themselves. Names disappear and reappear in accelerated sequence. And for the first time, he sees something that completely destabilizes him. Multiple versions of himself emerge in the records at the same time, not as physical clones, but as file entries. Daniel Harper, researcher Daniel Harper, case closed. Daniel Harper, corrected interference. Daniel Harper, authorized return, 1974. Reality isn't just recording it. He's trying to determine which version of it is valid. The climax intensifies when the core speaks again, now with more direct clarity. You're not the first to arrive here. You're the permitted continuation. The room begins to collapse into repeating patterns. Corridors appear and disappear. Fragments of Holloway Manor emerge within the central space, like physical memories superimposed on the present. Daniel sees himself in different positions within the manor, entering, observing, writing, retreating, as if all previous attempts were happening simultaneously. And then he understands the true workings of the place. The mansion doesn't hide its past. She recycles attempts at understanding until they fit into an acceptable version of reality. The final conflict is not physical. There is no way to destroy the core because it is not a single entity. It is a continuity correction system. Daniel decides to act differently. If the system rewrites records, it stops trying to be understood by itself. He picks up the notebook and for the first time doesn't write to record things. He writes to break the sequence. I don't accept imposed continuity. I am not a record. I am an interruption. The instant he writes this, the environment reacts with immediate instability. The document layers begin to lose synchronization. The core freezes for a moment, as if processing a logical impossibility. The voice returns, now with a variation. Continuity error detected. The structure begins to partially collapse. But along with the collapse, something else happens. The versions of Daniel in the records begin to dissolve, except for one, the version that just went in there. He realizes that the system is trying to preserve only one coherent line of reasoning, eliminating all other interpretations. The climax reaches its peak when he understands that the only way to escape is not to defeat the system, but to refuse to be consolidated by it. And for the first time, he makes an irreversible decision. He erases his own name from the notebook, not physically, but symbolically, tearing up the pages where their identity was being recorded. The space reacts violently. The entire mansion seems to lose stability. Corridors clash with each other. The core begins to fragment sentences. Identity not confirmed. Registration collapses. Interrupted continuity. Daniel doesn't wait for the reaction to end. He runs, not out of the mansion, but out of its reading system, and at the moment he passes through one of the fissures in space, everything around him ceases to be structure, and it becomes absence. Daniel doesn't know exactly when the movement ends, because there's no longer a clear sense of displacement. What exists after the collapse isn't an immediate outside of Holloway Manor, but a kind of suspension, as if reality itself were reconstructing its rules. When his perception finally stabilizes, he is back on the dirt road that leads to Pinebrook. The mansion is there, entire, property, silent, as if nothing had happened. Daniel remains still for a few minutes, trying to understand what is real continuity and what is merely a preserved version of memory. The notebook is no longer with him. The notes have disappeared. Even the marks he used to make to keep track of time no longer exist on his hands or in his immediate memory, but something remains, the feeling of rupture. He decides to return to the city. Pinebrook, however, is not exactly the same. There's no fanfare, no obvious changes that would catch the eye of any ordinary observer, but Daniel notices small differences that can't be ignored by someone who's been on the other side of the mansion. A slightly different name on a street sign, a face he recognizes, but which now belongs to a different role in the city, a local event he knows he experienced differently, but which is now remembered in an alternative way by everyone. Reality has not been destroyed. It was adjusted. Upon attempting to access the court files again, he discovers that his name no longer appears in investigation records. There is no proof of his arrival as a journalist in Pinebrook. There is no consistent lodging history. It's as if his presence has been partially de-indexed from the official world, but it still exists, and that's the most important thing. The central conflict was not completely resolved. It was contained within an acceptable version of reality. Holloway Manor remains an active structure, but now seems more distant, less accessible, as if operating on another level of existence. Daniel gradually understands what happened. He didn't destroy the system. he broke his own integration into it. The consequences of this appear subtly and constantly. People sometimes hesitate to look at him for longer than they should. Some conversations seem to be interrupted before they even begin, as if information about him is not fully available in the city's collective memory. And yet, he's still there, not as a recognized researcher, but as an unrecorded variable. The world moved on, but left a small flaw where it should have been fully integrated. In a final attempt to confirm the truth, Daniel returns alone to the edge of the Holloway Manor property. The structure is still there. But now, for the first time, there is no sense of immediate response to his gaze. There is no perceptible adjustment in the environment. The house does not react. And that's new, because before, she always reacted. He then understands that something has changed irreversibly. Not the mansion, but the relationship between him and her. He no longer belongs to the cycle she controls, nor has he been completely freed from it. He is in an intermediate state, an existence that cannot be completely recorded nor completely erased. The ultimate consequence is neither destruction nor victory. It is incomplete permanence. That same night, observing Pinebrook from a distance, Daniel notices something even more unsettling. There are other spots in the city where the same kind of structural silence seems to exist. Not exactly like the mansion, but like echoes of it. Small areas where reality seems slower, more rigid, less spontaneous, and he understands the true scope of what he saw. Holloway Manor was not a single isolated point. He was an example. A replicable continuity control system. The story doesn't end with a complete resolution. It ends with an expanded awareness of the problem. Daniel doesn't know if anyone else notices this. But now he understands. And that, in itself, places it within a new layer of the same mystery. He walks away from the road slowly, without looking back. Because deep down, he knows, some things never truly end. They simply cease to be recorded in the same way. Months later, Pinebrook continues its routine as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The streets remain silent, commerce operates at the same slow pace, and Holloway Mansion remains in the background, observing without being observed in return. Daniel is no longer seen frequently in the city. For some residents, he was never really there. For others, he's just another visitor who left without explanation. There are even those who swear they remember him vaguely, like a figure who passed by quickly and disappeared before being understood. But on isolated occasions, when the city is emptier and the wind seems heavier, there are still those who say they see someone standing on the road leading to the mansion, gazing at the horizon for too long, without getting closer, without backing down, between two states. And somewhere in the unrecorded area of Pinebrook, something remains active, not as a visible presence, but as a continuation. Holloway Manor remains intact, but it is no longer just a place. It is a constant possibility, a structure that seems to exist in parallel to everyday life, awaiting any attempt to be understood again. And perhaps that is what most disturbs what remains of the story. There is no real sense of closure. It just feels like everything has been put on hold, as if the next attempt were already being prepared on some invisible level of reality. If this story captivated you from beginning to end, consider what's truly more frightening, the unknown, or what has been rewritten so many times that no one remembers what it was like before. Leave a comment below with what you believe Holloway Manor really is, a cursed place, an experiment, or something even more impossible to explain. And if you enjoy dark stories full of mystery and twists that challenge reality, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. New stories like this might be closer than you think, perhaps even around the next corner you think you know well. Now tell me, where are you watching this story from?